Hi! Today I'm baking an olive sourdough bread. Let's see how I do it. I start the bread with scaling the ingredients. This is a bread with Preferment, and for this I need 36 grams mature sourdough starter, 200 grams of water, and 180 grams of strong bread flour. The next day, for the final dough, I scale in advance 720 grams of strong bread flour, 100 grams of rye flour, 15 grams of salt, 495 grams of water, and 170 grams of cut olives. After scaling, I mix the ingredients for the Preferment in the evening. The Preferment is a part of the bread dough that is mixed in advance. Making a bread with Preferment has advantages in terms of strengthening the dough structure and improving the flavor while reducing the time of bulk fermentation. This Preferment contains a small part of sourdough starter compared to the flour and water in which it is mixed in, and this allows the Preferment to rise slowly overnight when kept at room temperature. The next day, to start the Autolyse phase, I mix only the flours with water reserved for the final dough. No Preferment and no salt is added at this stage. I use partially for this dough a standing mixer. If you have one at home, put it at work. If you don't, mixing by hand is a simple alternative. The idea at this step is to mix just to well combine the flour and water and not more. That is done for me in less than 1 minute at the slowest speed of my mixer. Please note that I speed up my video when my mixer is working. At this stage, the dough has no structure because the gluten is not yet developed. I make this Autolyse phase in order to bond the gluten without mixing. I just need to leave the flour to hydrate at room temperature, and magically, when I come back 2 hours later, I'll notice a clear elasticity of the dough. After 16 hours from the moment I make the Preferment, its volume has almost doubled, and it's time to put it now over the Autolyse dough. This is a stiff dough, and incorporating the Preferment into the dough can be a challenge in order to make a homogeneous composition. I turn on the mixer for approximately 5 minutes on its lowest speed. Once I add the Preferment, the process of fermentation starts, and for this recipe I do a total bulk fermentation of 3 hours and a half only. But for now, after adding the Preferment, I leave the dough to rest. Please note that to make it more simple, when I mention 30 minutes between steps, this includes also the time of handling the dough for that specific step. To follow the schedule of this recipe, I simply put an alarm every 30 minutes to synchronize with all the steps before I shape the dough. I add now the salt, and I mix for 3 minutes to incorporate it well. Then I leave again the dough to rest. I am done with the mixer, and I take now the dough out of the bowl on a wet table board, and I do some stretch and folds to organize the structure of the dough. This also helps me to easily divide it into pieces. Each piece of dough, I keep it in covered glass bowls until the next step. I show you from now on the steps that I do for only one piece of dough. As for the second one, they are exactly the same. Now I have to stretch the dough in a big squared shape. This process is called lamination and helps to organize the gluten structure that leads in the end to a nicely raised bread. It is just at this step that I add the olives between the layers of the folds of the dough. I improve the dough structure also by performing 3 sets of coil folds at 30 minutes interval. With such a stiff dough, rolling up the dough under while performing the coil folds could be a bit tricky if you are used with a more wet dough, but keep on doing these coil folds because they are helping a lot. Last step for this day is to shape the dough. First, I flour well the bannetons, although a stiff dough tends to stick less. Then, I take it out from the glass bowls. I stretch it gently to avoid losing the bubbles already formed during the fermentation. push the loaf from the sides using the friction with the table in my advantage. I do this in order to increase the tension on the surface of the dough. I put the loaf face down in the already floured panettone. I cover with a shower cap and I place it in the fridge for 16 hours. In the fridge, the fermentation slows down substantially, but the flavor is improved. The next day, the dough is not raised that much, and this is totally normal. Today is the baking day. First, I preheat the oven, but I'll explain this in a minute. I take the loaf out of the fridge and reverse the panettone on a baking sheet. Scoring the loaf when it's cold is much easier. With the help of a blade, I make an incision in the bread of 1 to 2 centimeters deep. Scoring is not done just for the bread to look nice. By scoring the bread, the tension from the surface is broken and the baker practically controls the inside expansion. A bread that is not scored will not achieve its maximum degree of rising, and it might expand in less expected places, like on the sides or even underneath. I bake using a stone that I heat in the oven for 45 minutes before I put the bread in. To create steam, I use lava rocks that are placed in an old pan under the stone. I heat them together with the stone. After sliding the loaves on the stone, I pour 200 milliliters of hot water over the lava rocks to create steam and maintain the bread in this humid environment for the first part of the baking. After 20 minutes at 270 degrees Celsius, the bread reached its maximum expansion and starts browning on the surface. I turn on the ventilator of the oven to release the steam and reduce the temperature to 220 degrees Celsius. I continue baking at this temperature for 25 minutes more. Although it is extremely tempting, I need to leave the bread to cool until it reaches the room temperature. I reach now my favorite moment of baking bread, and this is when I cut it.